It's loading. 1 minute here.
Just let us know when you're live. You go, we're live.
It won't tell me the exact moment, but I think we should be live streaming right about now. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Sunday afternoon with co-hosts Craig Trulia and Erick Ibarra. Joined by renowned guest, Dr. Peter Kreeft, who is a professor of philosophy at Boston College and the King's College. He's the author of numerous books, including A Summa of the Summa and a Handbook to Christian Apologetics, and also Heaven, the Heart's Deepest Longing. Dr. Kreeft, it's great to have you on the show. How are you?
Let God decide that. I feel fine.
Good. It is definitely an honor to have you. I know all of us have greatly benefited from your work, especially your Summa to the Summa. At least speaking for me personally, that's the one I've benefited most from. But I've also really enjoyed your Socrates and Kant book. That was extremely profound for me. So it's definitely an honor to have you.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
All right. Well, let's dive into some questions. Now, I know that you've done a lot of work on St. Thomas Aquinas. So let me maybe ask you this. What would you say is the primary reason why it might be important for a Christian to study St. Thomas Aquinas today? Why is he important?
So that his thought can be one with his prayer, so that faith and reason can operate as two wings of the same bird that carries him into the air.
Okay. And what exactly would you recommend? Would you say that an individual should just dive into the Summa, or would you say that perhaps there are some other materials that they should read before they dive into his works?
Well, diving into the Summa without any preparation is sort of like diving into the deep end of a swimming pool. If you're a good swimmer, fine, but if not, you need a little help. Which I tried to provide in my Summa of the Summa, which takes the most important philosophical passages of the Summa Theologia and explains them and footnotes them and edits them.
Yeah, and I think also a good part about that book is that you included a glossary of terms, philosophical and theological terms at the end. And that was extremely helpful for me because when I just, first opened up the Summa Theologica, it did not make sense to me at all. But I found myself thumbing through the glossary that you provided and finding key definitions to terms there that help decipher the Summa. So I definitely think that was helpful. I know there was another book that my brother was reading, authored by you. I think it was an introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas.
That was probably an audio lecture for recorded books. That was more general. But you're right. In reading Aquinas himself, it's essential to get the vocabulary right. That's the only real obstacle, because Aquinas is a very clear and simple and commonsensical thinker, but he uses a very technical terminology, most of which comes from Aristotle. So you have to master the language first. Once you learn to speak the language, it's a cinch.
Mm. Do you think that maybe the study of Aquinas can be dispensed at this point post-Vatican II, or do you think that the magisterium still has its approbation behind him, or should we start exploring other theologians like Duns Scotus? Because I've often heard, especially in interacting with individuals who are wanting to address Eastern Orthodox, some people want to dispense with Thomas Aquinas and they will try to opt for Duns Scotus. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that he is still backed by the magisterium today?
I don't think it. I know it. The church has consistently, ever since the Council of Trent, held Aquinas up as a primary and unique and unrivaled source of theological wisdom. Of course, he's not infallible. Of course, he's not the final answer to everything, but there's no one who's more reliable than Aquinas, including Scotus, who's actually much more difficult to read than Aquinas and much less commonsensical, although he too is quite brilliant.
Yeah. Well, I also noticed that you did some videos recently with Prager University, and I thought they were extremely profound. You were talking about suffering and evil in the world and how this can be reconciled with God. So maybe can we speak to that a little bit? Let me ask you specifically, what would you say is the best way to explain the existence of evil in light of the fact that God is good? Because anytime I have interaction with atheists or agnostics, that seems to be the go-to argument that they try to use to disprove or cast doubt on the existence of God, the issue of theodicy. They say that, if God is good, you wouldn't have the existence of evil. What exactly would you say in response to that?
First of all, I'd say that you're fortunate in finding some fairly reasonable atheists, because that's the only serious argument against the existence of God. Too many atheists just assume that science has disproved religion and that Darwin has replaced Genesis, et cetera, which is simply nonsense. But the problem of evil is a very serious problem. It certainly seems as if you believe in a God who has all power and all benevolence or goodwill and all intelligence, that it would logically follow that there can't be any evil, and there is. So you have to explain it. You have to refute the objection, which is a very serious objection. And you do so in two ways. First of all, physical evil or natural evil, things like disease and death and hurricanes, I think are inherent in any finite material system. Two material things compete. Two material entities can't occupy the same space at the same time. So if there's a rock that's blocking my way, it may not be blocking your way. But moral evil is the most serious evil. If we were all saints, everybody would be deeply wise and deeply happy, and the physical evils would hardly matter. So that's the much more serious kind of evil. And the answer to that is much simpler and more obvious. Moral evil comes only from human free will, not from God, not from nature. You don't blame rocks or dogs or planets for sinning. And then if you can relate those two things, and if you can show, at least, if not beyond a reasonable doubt, as a reasonable hypothesis, that most physical evils are conditioned by our attitude towards them, or by our moral evil and the unwisdom that comes from it, then you can connect those two things. That's the mysterious thing. The fact that we're Cartesian by nature, that we think in terms of two separate and distinct categories, the spiritual and the physical, makes it much more difficult for us to relate physical evils to moral evils.
Mm-hmm. On a related note here, another thing that I've noticed whenever I engage with atheists or agnostics and even others who have some kind of theistic view, one of their biggest objections is the existence of hell, especially if it's an eternal conscious suffering. They say that, how can this be reconciled with the goodness of God? Because, just thinking as a father here, if I knew that my children were going to reject God and spend eternity in hell, and I had the choice to create them or not, as a father, I would choose not to create them so that they don't have this eternal torment that they undergo. So how exactly would you say can we reconcile this matter, the existence of hell, with the goodness of God?
There's two questions you're asking there. One is about the relation between hell and God, and the other is about the relation between hell and us. If you scratch the doctrine of free will, you find the doctrine of hell underneath it. Because if God is God the Father, instead of the Godfather, he makes you an offer you can refuse, rather than making you an offer you can't refuse. And refusing that offer, since God is the source of all joy as well as all goodness, necessarily means misery. I don't think you have to start with a concept of hell, which includes a torture chamber and demons inserting hot pitchforks into your unrepentant posteriors, and then prove that. any more than you have to start with the concept of God as a kind of a Gandalf in the sky. So the symbolic language about hell is not part of the dogma, but the existence of an alternative to heaven, the existence of the possibility of losing God forever, I think logically follows from the doctrine of free will, plus the fact that once you die, you're not in the universe anymore, so you're not in time, so you have no more second chance. The other question is a much more difficult one. How could you possibly be happy in heaven if somebody that you love is in hell? And that's one that you don't really have to answer, but even if you have a little bit of an answer to it, that would help. And I think a little bit of an answer is Aquinas' distinction between active love and passive love. Passive love is like falling in love or being overcome by some feeling of desire or compassion, whereas active love is a deliberate choice to will the good of the other. I don't think in heaven we're going to be victims of passive love. I think we're going to be much more like God and much more active. So yes, we will continue to love those that we loved on earth when we're in heaven, but the rebound effect on us, the fact that our passions are rightly almost destroyed by horrible tragedy here when we see that tragedy happen to somebody that we love, that doesn't have to continue to exist in heaven. In other words, our love will be as transformed as our bodies. It'll take a form that is more real but almost unimaginable.
Would you say that it is reasonable to hope that all will be saved? I think von Balthasar had a book titled "Dare We Hope That All May Be Saved," something to that effect. How likely do you think that is, or do you think it is much more likely that Augustine or Aquinas' view that very few would be saved is more likely?
Well, the ancients, I think, tended to make the mistake of assuming that most would not be saved. We moderns tend to make the opposite mistake of assuming that all or almost all will be saved. We simply don't know. When the disciples asked the Lord, Lord, will many be saved? He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He said simply strive to enter in. So we have to be a bit more agnostic about that. Yes, we have to hope that all men will be saved. What good is our hope if we hope only for a few and not for all? Is it likely? No, I don't think so. If Christ's words about Judas Iscariot are taken seriously, namely, it would have been better for that man if he had never been born, I don't think there's much chance for people like him. But how many will be like him? How many will be able to refuse God in full knowledge at the end? I don't know. I think it's possible to imagine that a monster like Hitler or Stalin would be so threatened by God that they would say, no, I don't want your heaven. I couldn't endure it. But I personally think that's going to be a rather small minority. But the basic answer is we just don't know.
Fair enough. Craig, let me give you a chance to jump in here. I don't want to hog Dr. Kreeft. I know you have a few questions.
Well, we all have to share here. I do think I want to ask a follow-up on the topic we had. Dr. Kreeft, did you ever see that episode of The Twilight Zone where the thief gets killed and he pretty much dies and has the penthouse apartment and he's in the casino and he always wins? Do you know the episode I'm talking about?
Yep. And he gets bored, and the St. Peter figure comes and he says, where's my buddies? Where's Lefty and Two Finger? Oh, they're in the other place. Well, that's where I belong. Let me go there. Well, you can't go there. There's a great gulf fix. You know the rules. But I thought heaven was where you got everything you wanted. St. Peter says, no, that's the other place. That's where you are now.
And I think that gets at your point about free will, because I'm Orthodox, and I think I don't know. I don't really think this is inconsistent with Roman Catholicism, but it's almost the way we speak about the afterlife is much in more common parlance the way what you're discussing, which is, damnation would be a will eternally turned against God, because what's heaven? Eternally basking in in the presence of God and looking upon his face and worshiping him. And singing his praises. That doesn't sound a lot of fun if you're someone on your way to hell. Most people have will turn against that.
When I was a teenager, I had my only very serious crisis of faith. I thought heaven was a kind of eternal church service, so I didn't want to go to heaven. And I certainly didn't want to go to the other place, and I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Fortunately, I revised my concept of heaven. No, I don't think there's any serious difference between Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, except for the authority of the Pope. I think everything else is negotiable, including Thomas Aquinas, because a lot more Orthodox are coming to love Aquinas lately, by the way.
Now, you touched on the importance of studying Thomas Aquinas pertaining to reason and theology, but the import of that would be that it would help people acquire the spiritual disciplines of Aquinas. Could you elaborate on that at all?
I don't think there's a serious difference at all between the spiritual disciplines of the East and the West. Theological systems can be subject to apparent logical laws and apparently contradict each other, but this would be a good thing for you to do, or that would be a good thing for you to do. Statements like that don't usually come under the law of non-contradiction. They're both ands rather than either ors. So like all the recent popes, I think it's essential that East and West learn from each other. We need much more of your mystical spirituality, and I think you need much more of our practical, logical, incarnational spirituality.
Now, on a different topic, talking about the problem of evil, not the problem of evil, the moral argument in favor of the existence of God. I'm sorry, you brought that up in a Prager University video. I'm wondering, in your presentation, that topic, and your writings on this topic, what philosophers and maybe what from the scriptures are you pulling from? What has informed your view of that topic?
There's two versions of the argument. The traditional one starts with the natural law, assumes what every culture until our own assumes, that there is some objective, universal set of principles about good and evil, what C.S. Lewis called the Tao in The Abolition of Man. And once you accept that, it's a fairly short step between an absolute law and an absolute lawgiver. But in an age of moral relativism, when people are skeptical of the natural law, you have to use a different kind of argument. And I think Cardinal Newman gives you the first clear classic version of that. It's the conscience argument. If you still believe in at least a subjective absolute morality, that is, it's always wrong to disobey your own personal private conscience, no matter what it tells you to do, that is sufficient for showing that you're treating conscience as if it's an authoritative prophet of an infallible moral master. Who could that be but God? The danger of that argument is you might persuade somebody to take the opposite extreme, that of Ivan Karamazov, and say, if God does not exist, everything is permissible, and God does not exist, therefore everything is permissible, therefore I'll try to kill my conscience. But
well, that seems to be what we're getting today.
You'll find that you won't do it.
Now, would you agree with Kant that really the moral argument for the existence of God is the strongest, or do you think there's other stronger arguments?
I think it's the psychologically strongest.
Okay.
It's implicitly in the Bible, in Romans 1 and 2. And as I said a moment ago, it's impossible to really kill your conscience. You can try. You can try to rip up your moral motherboard, but it's going to be there. It's going to rise from the dead. There are things that, in the words of J. Budjushevsky, you can't not know. One of those things is you're absolutely obliged to do good and not evil.
Now, like, how about the cosmological and teleological arguments? I mean, they would seem so, self-apparent to pretty much anyone with any basic common sense, but they're so widely doubted by many at the collegial level. I mean, why do you think that is?
Well, science has nothing to do with it. Science just discovers how the details work. It's ideology. The teleological argument assumed that purpose is not merely subjective, that even unconscious beings are ordered by something, that they work for ends. That's an assumption which is commonsensical but not scientific. So if you think of the scientific method as the only reasonable method, you're not going to use a teleological argument.
Interesting.
But there's no scientific method for proof that only the scientific method is the right method. So that's a self-contradictory limitation.
Erick, I'm going to pass the football to you.
Okay. All right. Dr. Peter Kreeft, like we were talking before, this is exhilarating. I appreciate you coming on for us here. I would be astounded to, stand in front of you one day. So
no, you wouldn't.
So I appreciate your humility. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Michael Shermer. Have you? He's a popular atheist around debating.
Nope. I haven't.
Okay. Well, he might not be that popular then. But one of he debates a lot of theists, and there's one particular theist that he debated recently. His name was Dr. Brian Huffling, and Dr. Brian Huffling is a huge Thomistic philosopher in terms of that's his focus. And one of the objections that Dr. Michael Shermer brings up quite a bit is that, theists may have a way of accounting for the existence of moral evils, where a subject who has a will is acting. But what about things like a young little toddler who gets cancer and, God, who knows everything and controls and is all powerful, is just kind of watching while, for apparently no other reason from the atheistic point of view, other toddlers are just fine and safe and healthy. How would you respond to that objection, which says that since God can do something in that instance, and because we would do something ourselves if we saw a toddler who was getting close to a pool about to fall in, or a toddler who was playing with scissors and about to cut themselves or something like that, if the argument goes, if we're supposed to imitate God and God seems to just sit there and watch while these things happen, therefore God is the God that Christians defend do not exist. I think you understand what I'm saying. Yeah.
That's a strong argument. As I said, a physical evil is much harder to explain than moral evil. Well, first of all, we're not supposed to imitate God. We're supposed to imitate Christ. God the Father never became incarnate and doesn't have a human nature. So sitting in eternity and contemplating your own perfection, which is what God does, is not our first commandment. Our first commandment is to love.
Very good.
And to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if you look at Jesus, he's very active, very compassionate, very interventionist. That's our model.
Right.
Secondly, the answer to the atheist's very good question is, okay, you're saying that the universe we observe, where 2-year-olds get cancer and die, is not one that you as God would have created. All right, you're God. Create a better universe. What do? Do you intervene as we do? If your kid falls in the swimming pool, you jump in after him. Well, interventions are miracles. So is God going to perform a miracle every time he foresees a problem coming? And since most of those problems are caused by us, is he going to spiritually intervene and give you a frontal lobotomy before he sees an evil thought arising? That simply takes away your free will. And even to allow free-willed evil thoughts, but not evil deeds, requires so much intervention that for practical purposes, there's no free will. You try to murder somebody and the bullet turns to butter before it enters their body. So you can't murder.
Right. Yeah, very good. That's very good. Those 2 points are extremely strong and I think sufficient. Another
I think
objection.
most atheists, by the way, in my experience, most atheists don't really believe in free will. They tend to be scientific determinists or
Yes, I
materialists.
find that. Yep, that's an observation that is to
And
be
freedom
had.
is a very tricky concept. Kierkegaard said it was the cross that that rationalist philosophy was crucified on.
Yes.
Very difficult for reason to explain freedom.
Yeah.
But we experience our own free will and therefore responsibility. If you don't really have freedom, you're just a very complicated robot. And it's ridiculous to make judgments and rewards and punishments and to take justice seriously, which is the conclusion that many modern people follow out. Yes, be totally non-judgmental. Nobody's to blame for anything.
Very, very well.
But that's an absurd conclusion.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent one. Yeah. Speaking of freedom, I'm sure you're very familiar with this. Some of us who are still, younger and studying philosophy come across this, and it seems to be one of those giant objections that we get from not just atheists, but also theists. And, we spoke a little bit about Duns Scotus before, and this ties into some of the interaction that Eastern Orthodoxy has had with Thomas Aquinas. You are absolutely right. The Orthodox are getting very into Aquinas again. Returning to something that was prevalent in the medieval times in Byzantium. But one of the objections that we get today from theists and atheists against St. Thomas Aquinas, particularly his doctrine of divine simplicity, is that if God's will is equal to himself and his will is necessary because it's equal to himself, then is his will to create unfree. And since he allowed a sinful creation, would his permissibly willing a sinful creation also be necessary?
Well, I think that's a very high level question, which most ordinary people don't ask or get worried that much by. And my immediate answer to it is that certainly God's will is free, but it's also necessary. How something can be both free and eternal and unchangeable at the same time is a very tricky question to answer. But the data are clearly there. God is eternal, you can't change him, nothing can. God is free, that's the other part of the data. That's a bit like human free will and divine predestination. Difficult to reconcile, but they're two pieces of strong data that you can't simply ignore.
That's an excellent point, because I myself personally, I side with the Dominican tradition, which comes from Aquinas, Augustine, and then we would all argue from the scriptures, particularly St. Paul, that I believe in the predestination as espoused by St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa, which I understand there's some allowance for divergence in the Catholic Church, for centuries now, but that pretty much aligns with the same kind of paradox in the situation of free will and predestination, or human responsibility and divine providence and sovereignty. I think that's an excellent. I think Augustine is famous for saying, if you seek out the answer to these questions, behold, you may be sinning for asking something that's way too high for you to understand, something along those lines. But I think that's a sort of, all of us Christians have to realize that, like you said, we're all kind of Cartesian thinkers by nature. We have to have a healthy agnosticism about God as well, because even as much of a theist as we can be, there's so much we're not going to know. And that's excellent. The last
my
question.
Favorite sermon of all time. Let me tell you my favorite sermon of all time. I'll give you every word of it. There are just 4 words in it. God himself preached it to St. Catherine late in the Middle Ages. He said, there's only two things you need to know. This is a summary of all of divine revelation. Thing number one, I'm God. Thing number two, you're not.
Yeah, that's and it's unavoidable because we didn't create ourselves, and we don't write up our future. We're kind of at a brick wall, or you submit to God, and that's you believe in God, like Job. That's kind of the revelation.
As Aquinas said, if you understand it, it's not God.
Right. The last question I have here is a simple one, and don't feel bad for recommending your own books that you've authored, but what are two good books that you would recommend for somebody to either get into Aquinas or the scholastic tradition in general, which would include Aquinas and others?
Well, I've written some, I think, helpful books there, not just the Summa of the Summa, but also my volume on medieval philosophy in Socrates' Children from St. Augustine's Press. I think Ralph McInerney's introduction to Aquinas is a very good one. It's called A Handbook for Peeping Thomists. And Joseph Pieper's little book on scholasticism, which deals with the medieval philosophers other than Aquinas, is also quite short, simple, and helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Dr. Kreeft, let me ask you one more question, if you don't mind, before I get to some of the questions from the live chat. I know you've written a book on heaven, and I'd like to ask, what exactly is heaven, and what will the blessed be doing or do for all eternity?
Well, heaven is the place or condition or state of both soul and body after the resurrection that we will live in or inhabit eternally together with God. It's not a literal place somewhere in the universe. You can't get there in a rocket ship. It's not simply a utopian state in the future because it's not in the universe or in time that's measured by our clocks. So it's living in God, sharing his very life. And since his life is active, we will be active. We're not just going to be passive. So what do we do in heaven? I think you do, in a perfect way, the things that you're designed to do and do in an imperfect way on earth. And that is to perform the two human activities that no animal can perform. One is intellectual understanding, and the other is freely choosing to love. And you direct that understanding and love to yourself and to your neighbor and to God. And we don't do that very well in this life. So I think in the next life, you will do 6 things perfectly. You will know God, know yourself, love yourself, know your neighbor, and love your neighbor. What form that will take, whether there will be brewers of heavenly beer and consumers thereof, I don't know. We're free to exercise our own imagination there.
You know, you mentioned that there is the existence of the soul and body that the individual will have in eternity. What would you say to an individual who is perhaps agnostic and does not believe in the existence of the soul? If they just said, look, once we die, that's it, there's nothing after that. How exactly would you argue that there is an immaterial aspect to mankind that survives after death?
That strikes me as a very easy question to answer, but I find that those who seriously embrace materialism are very difficult to convince. I would say you are right now refuting your own materialism in believing something. Do subatomic particles believe? Do rocks believe? Do planets believe? Do galaxies believe? Does matter believe? Does the brain believe? A moment after death, the brain is still there, although it's not functioning. It's not believing anything, but it's there. What is it that transforms a brain that doesn't do anything to a brain that does do something? The instrument of consciousness. That's what you have right now. You're conscious, you're thinking, you're believing, you're doubting. Those are things that matter can't do. my idea that one of the pistons in my car is malfunctioning is a true idea only because it corresponds to the fact that one of the pistons is not functioning. But the idea doesn't come from a piston. The idea comes from a mind. It's a different kind of thing. I think the mistake of the materialist is that he treats ideas as if they were things, entities, geometrical arrangements of atoms, or processes of electrical charges. That's not what an idea is. The idea about an electrical charge is not an electrical charge. The idea about anything can't be simply a part of that thing. In other words, they don't realize the meaning of the word idea. They don't realize that an idea is an intention, a pointing arrow that moves in a certain direction. They don't see an idea as teleological. They simply see it as a material fact. That's a category confusion.
Is it fair to say that you're also essentially saying that there's more to man than simply the sum total of all his parts?
And that can be scientifically proved. There's abundant evidence that the mind is more than the brain. Mm. That even when the brain does not function in near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences or mystical experiences, consciousness is going on and is understanding and sometimes even seeing things that are true and can be checked out. There's abundant evidence for that, and materialists either ignore or are totally cynical about that evidence, and they think it's all a sham and deliberately made up. But if they go to either the University of Virginia or the University of Connecticut, they'll find that there are scientific institutes in both places that have massive data that show that materialism simply isn't true. That even in this life, people often function mentally when the brain is dead.
Do you think that they're so reluctant to accept these things because perhaps if they accept the existence of God, that means that they're going to be morally responsible now to a creator, and they just don't want to be responsible?
Well, of course, that's what the Bible says. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. Why? Because they're wicked. Jesus himself said that. Why do people not believe in God? Because they don't want to. God is too inconvenient. If there's a God, you're not the driver. You have to take your hands off the steering wheel and trust the man who is driving. And some people just don't want to do that.
When Romans says that the individual that people know that God exists because they see his handiwork in creation, so they know there must be a creator, but they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. Do you think that applies to every individual, that every atheist knows that there is a God, they're just simply suppressing the truth? Or is that just more of a general statement that all of mankind in general knows? Or do you think it addresses every individual? Every individual knows God exists. What are your thoughts?
I don't think that's universally true on the conscious level, but I do think it's universally true on the unconscious level. Mm-hmm. I mean, if our souls were designed in heaven, that data, so to speak, is not an option. Mm-hmm. That's essential. A person who in no way at all knows God and is not responsible for his ignorance, that's not a human being. I never met such a human being.
Mm. Before I get into the questions,
wait a minute. I have to add something here.
Sure.
There's a common misunderstanding. People start with a certain idea of God, a theological idea, which is almost imaginable, and then they say, "Well, I don't think everybody knows that, or I don't believe in that." Many people who don't. They're right. You don't start with an idea of God that you can comprehend and then say, well, that's in your heart too. Yeah. But you do start with a knowledge that good is to be done and evil is to be avoided, and that truth and falsity are not the same thing, and that there is meaning and order and design everywhere. You may be an atheist, but you can't deny those facts, which are in fact implicitly a knowledge of God. Because what God is truth and is goodness and is love and is meaning. They may not put a face on it because their idea of a face is much too human. But to cease to believe in meaning and truth and goodness and love is to cease to be human.
Craig, did you have a follow-up question there before I get into the chat questions?
Yeah, just real quick, like obviously there's a difference, people with their hearts have stopped, have had near-death experiences and things to that effect. I think the atheist would respond to that with, well, there's a difference between a brain that's starting to rot and like someone who just died and there's still oxygen in the brain and there's still the body as it dies, chemicals are released and things like that. And these could be perceived as phenomena because the brain's neurochemical. I mean, what would your response to that be?
There's not the slightest shred of scientific evidence for that statement.
Okay.
That at the moment of death, the brain, as far as we can tell, is not functioning in any of the ways that we know it has to function in order to have any kind of consciousness at all. So that position is one that requires more faith than I have. The faith that sometime in the future, science will discover some invisible energy in the brain that explains these things, but it hasn't discovered it yet.
Great answer. Thank you.
Dr. Kreeft, let me ask a question on behalf of Luke in the chat. He asks, how can we be faithful to scriptural and traditional language of the vengeance of God and the wrath to come without portraying our triune God as a capricious Zeus?
Oh, well, that's a fairly easy one to answer. All our language about God is anthropomorphic because human beings appear in our immediate experience and our consciousness and our imagination. God does not. So the only language that God can use is analogical or symbolic language. I go out into the backyard without sunblock. I sit there for an hour and I come in and I'm surprised that I have red blotches on me and I've got sunburn. And I say, oh, the sun was angry at me. That's a projection. There is indeed consequences. There is indeed a kind of a cosmic justice. If you go out without sunblock, you get sunburned. So the wrath of God is a reality, but it's not a literal reality. He doesn't get mad at you. He is love. But when you're on the wrong side, when you're opposing God, when you're going against his will, it's as if he's angry at you because you suffer. You are inevitably punished by the natural law. You jump off a cliff and you break your bones. And to say, well, the cliff hates me, it threw me off, is to deny your own free will and responsibility for jumping. But there is a kind of karma or cosmic justice. You throw a deed into the universe and it's good and it comes back and benefits you. You throw an evil deed into the universe and it always comes back and punishes you.
Okay. Kale asks, I know you've experienced some charismatic movement activities. How do you reconcile those experiences with a much more sober Latin Mass and taming of the passions? Do you find a rift between these two modes of spirituality?
Emotionally, yes. Theologically, no. Theologically, we have to be consistent, and there are heresies. And the same is true morally, but aesthetically and liturgically, the church is a big place, and God deliberately makes room for a lot of different styles, all of which emphasize different aspects of the human soul, the human spirit. So I personally love the Latin Mass and Gregorian chant and the Book of Common Prayer and the liturgy of Chrysostom. And charismatic worship is not my style, but I know it's for real and it does a lot of good. And God approves it. That's clear in Scripture. These gifts are powers that are given to us. So we all have to expand our appreciation of them. In other words, liturgically, I'm a pluralist, even though morally and theologically, I'm an exclusivist.
Okay. And another question. What are some of the ways in which you would recommend that we can have a better dialogue about reunification with the Eastern Orthodox?
Oh, that's a big one. The first and most important thing to do is listen humbly, to honestly admit that nobody's got all the goods on their side, and we can all learn something from each other. And even that is not enough, because that sounds like an agenda. Okay, here is how we're going to create a unified church. No, you sit back and listen, and you say to God, I know much less than I think I know here. You've got to teach me. You've got to do it. And if you really have that attitude as your most fundamental attitude, if the thing you want to do most of all is to just obey the baton of a conductor who's conducting this orchestra, the Eastern and Western parts of which are not quite playing in harmony, if you follow that conductor, you'll achieve unity, because that's his will.
We have another question from Thomas. He asks if you would mind commenting on the essence and energies distinction. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a pretty technical question. I never quite fully understood the Eastern notion of the divine energies. There's something like a dynamic concept of Platonic ideas. There are many rather than one, so they're not God himself. But on the other hand, they're eternal and necessary. They're not creatures either. And every being has to be either the creator or a creature. So you have to create some kind of category that fits between God and creatures. Some of them use Plato and say they are the divine ideas. Aquinas, for instance, tries to reconcile the oneness of God with the manyness of ideas by saying these are potential participations in the unitary divine perfection. That seems to me to be a good synthesis of the Eastern and Western ways of speaking. But that's a very tricky problem. And I don't think we're ever going to get a clear answer to that question. And therefore, I would counsel a very open-minded and skeptical attitude there. Even in our metaphysics, I think we have to say what Hamlet says to Horatio, who doesn't know what to think when he sees Hamlet's father's ghost. Hamlet says, Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy. So maybe there are more dimensions of being, more levels of metaphysics than we can quite comprehend. That's a good one, and I don't have a clear answer to it.
Okay. And do you believe that Jesus was capable of sinning? Why or why not?
Yes and no. Capable in theory. De jure, yes, he had free will. Therefore, he was tempted, and the temptations were not fakes. De facto, he was incapable of sinning. He was perfect.
Okay. Craig, Eric, did y'all have
like
any...
us in heaven? Are we going to have free will in heaven? Yes. Is anybody ever going to sin in heaven? No.
Fair enough.
It's like the angels. There's this window of opportunity where they had the fall, and now that just doesn't happen. It can't happen theologically. So it's, I don't know the reason for that, but that is consistent with what we know.
Once you have the beatific vision, there's no possibility of temptation. Once you see how beautiful God is and how ugly sin is, you'll just laugh at sin.
Craig, Eric, did y'all have any final questions for Dr. Kreeft?
Well, I had a slight comment / question. Dr. Peter Kreeft, your answer on the whole energy and essence distinction thing, that really reminded me of the writings of Dr. Erick Moskal. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him. He was an old Anglican.
Yes. Yeah. Brilliant man. I read him. I love him.
Okay, I just wanted to know if you've read him, because he has. I have a number of his books on my shelf, and I find him approaching this issue of the essence and energies distinction quite like the way you summarized. And I just wanted to know if you've ever heard of him, and if you thought he was a coherent and erudite thinker on this issue, or on.
I know C.S. Lewis knew him and spoke very highly of him. I read some of his devotional stuff, which I admire very much. I'll have to look up his more theoretical stuff. Yes, I would.
Yeah, he's got. I mean, if you just on Amazon, it doesn't seem like he's that popular, but I just think his writings are phenomenal. I just wanted to know if you've heard of him.
Yep. The little I know of him, I give him an A+.
Right.
Dr. Kreeft, you don't have to get too personal if you don't want to, but what devotional practices would you recommend really help draw a Christian closer to God?
Well, the single answer to that question is to pray. But in order to pray without ceasing, in order to combine work and prayer, you have to arrange your time and be fanatical about putting prayer first. You wake up in the morning and the first thought that comes into your head is, this is what I got to do today, and this is what I'm desiring to do today, this is what I'm fearing will happen today. You've got to kill those thoughts. You've got to be merciless. And you've got to say, God, you're God, and I'm not, and I'm here, and I'm going to be so busy today that I have to take more time to pray, not less. And if you give him those loaves and fishes, even when you don't feel like it, and even though you're not feeling very high, he will somehow or other miraculously multiply them. And at the end of the day, you'll say, gee, I accomplished more than I thought I could today. I wonder how that happened.
Dr. Kreeft, I have one final question for you. If an individual knew that they were going to be stranded on an island in the next week and they could only take one of your books with them, which book would you recommend that they take?
Oh, I wish you hadn't said one of my books, because then I could give a very simple answer, namely How to Build a Boat.
Did you make that book?
Is there a particular one that's your favorite?
Well, I'd probably give them my anthology of Aquinas, not so much the Summa of the Summa, which is more theoretical and philosophical, but one called Practical Theology, which is Aquinas' spiritual advice. And the reason I'd give them is that it's Aquinas and not just Kreeft.
Mm-hmm. Good. Fair enough. All right. Well, Dr. Kreeft, thank you so much for coming on the show. We definitely enjoyed it. It was a very high honor to have you. I hope that we can have you on again.
Thank you very much. It was an honor for me too, and a lot of fun. God bless you.
Did y'all have it? I'm sorry.
Oh,
Are you there?
Goodbye and God bless.
Oh, okay. Well, yes. Again, thank you for coming on. Craig, Eric, thank y'all both also for being on the show.
It was an honor. Thank you so much. God bless you all.
Yes, indeed. Everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Everybody, please comment, like, subscribe, share this video on your social media, spread it far and wide. And I think that'll do it. So everybody enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and God bless you all.
Thank you. Bye.